Okay, so first things first, when we start shading on the grid portrait, we need to remember exactly the same shading techniques that we learned in Art 1, right? So remember this when we did the value scale practice and we learned the idea of building up those light layers of value. We talked about smooth stroke marks, so using that coloring book technique to kind of fill in the lighter areas to make it look really smooth. We talked about using the different levels of value to create contrast and being able to put different values next to each other without necessarily like outlining between them so that the contrast is coming just from the lights and darks and not from like hard outlines. So all of that is going to apply now to our grid portraits and to our faces. So over the next week or so, these are, I know this looks weird, these are the demos that we're going to do. So we're going to start with the eyes today, and then later this week we'll do noses and mouths, and next week we will do hair. So those are coming. So after today, you should be able to shade any parts of the skin, cheeks, forehead, chin, neck, stuff like that. And eyes once I do the demo, but wait on the nose and the mouth and the hair and the background because I will give you more explicit instructions about that. Okay, so these are some that I have done demos on before. So I'm pretty sure I have a video somewhere of this eye, and then I also have one of doing this eye. This one is this one. I don't remember which one that one is from, but the concept is the same. And what I'm going to show you today is not just how to shade it, but how to think about it. Because if you think about it in the right form, it will help you identify where the highlights and shadows go, even beyond what is visible in the photo. It'll just help you to kind of identify and see it a little bit better. So I can link those videos to you if you want to see other examples as well. When we look at eyes, I know this is a little shiny and weird. Maybe that's better. There we go. The concept of eyes, when you think about them three-dimensionally, is, right, we know that humans have eyeballs, right? And we know that that is a rounded form. It's like a sphere. So if you've ever like shaded a sphere and made it look like it has a highlight and a shadow and maybe a shadow underneath, and you made it look three-dimensional, it's very much the same concept as that, but we don't necessarily see the entire round spherical shape. We only see the part that kind of peeks through where the eyelid opens. But what you can think of as you're shading that is you have that rounded shape, and then it's kind of, I use the term blanketed by the skin for the eyelid on top and then for the eyelid on the bottom. So whether you're looking at that eyeball shape from the side, this one's a little more of a profile view. This one is more straight on to the front. We see that the eyeball is rounded, and we see that there are multiple layers of skin. There's kind of the eyelid itself. That's the part that directly touches the eyeball. And then there's kind of the like it's called the hooding of the eyelid that is above that. So you have to kind of break it down into how many layers there are of dimension over the top of that eyeball. And then some are going to have kind of a flatter appearance on the bottom eyelid, and then some are going to have some sort of other definition of that form, okay? So this one, we almost don't see the eyeball eyelid at all. We see very little of the eyeball, but then there's a lot of hooding that kind of comes down over that. And because of that coming down, if you think about the eyeball, and then you have the eyelid, and then you have the hooding over that, it creates that shadow on the eyeball. It's kind of like when you stand under a porch, like an overhang, and there's a shadow on you. So you have to actually shade on the eyeball where the shadow falls because of how the skin is kind of shading the light from that. So for today, which one of these do you want me to demo? Left or right? Which eyeball? Right one? Okay. So for this, I'll do this one. All right. Think about, now I don't have this gridded, so my proportions might not be super accurate here, and that's okay. But I want you to get the idea of the shading, right? So normally when you, in the past, may have drawn eyeball shapes, you may have done like the football, right? And then you have like the pupil shape in the middle. Maybe if you were super detailed, you had some eyelashes, right? We have to break it down into a few more shapes than that, okay? So we do have that eyeball in the middle, and then we're going to kind of look over the top. We have the eyelid here, and in this case, it comes up higher on this side and a little bit lower down here. Don't forget the tear duct. So the tear duct kind of expands out away from the eyeball a little bit. So the eyeball kind of rounds right here, right? So here's that tear duct shape. And then look at your angles, which I'm sure you've been doing with your grid, how the eyelid kind of covers that eyeball shape underneath. And if you have to draw the eyeball shape, go ahead and do that. Okay, because it will help you kind of think in terms of rounding, right? And then we have the eyelid, and sometimes the eyelid follows the under form of that eyeball shape underneath. And this one kind of does. And that would make sense, right? Because that eyelid is resting on where the eyeball shape is. Okay, so this is going to kind of shade out over here. This isn't like a hard line. This would be like this right here. And then it kind of comes down here. Okay, another really big misconception is people think that the white of your eyes is actually white. Okay, it is not. So for example, if we take the white of this paper, and this is a trick that you're going to be able to do with your entire drawing. Any value of skin or hair or any facial feature, compare a white piece of paper to the part that you are looking at. So if we compare the white of this paper to the white of that eyeball, look at how significantly darker that eyeball is. Even the lightest value, that lightest part of the eyeball is still significantly darker than the white of the paper. So you should make the same value comparison on your drawing as well. And you can hold this, if like say this is your drawing, right? You can hold this up to the white of the eyeball in your drawing, and then you can kind of compare. Is the contrast the same in your drawing as it is on the photo? Okay, because we're going to rely on the photo, remember, what we see, not just what our brains kind of assume that we know. Okay, so here is kind of just the general outline of the eye. All right, we are going to shade that eyeball as a spherical shape. So it's going to have contour. It's going to have lights and darks. Particularly, think about like where your light source is coming from. So in this case, the light source is kind of coming from up here, right? So it's going to be a little bit lighter on the top. And then as it gets into the creases and on the sides, it's going to get a little bit darker. Anywhere that is shaded because there's a form over the top of it is going to have a shadow. And then typically, because the eyelid is overlapping that eyeball, there tends to be kind of a line of shadow right under the eyelid. And that's a big part of what starts to make it look dimensional. Now I'm looking at this eyeball, and this whole side is darker than this side. So that's why I'm kind of concentrating some values over here. Now this might feel weird right now because right now I'm shading just like the eyeball part. But if we look at the eyeball compared to the skin, right, the skin is darker than the eyeball. So then we need to start darkening. Okay, there's a little bit of a highlight here in this example where the eyelid catches some of that light. So I'm going to pick up a little bit of a light line right there, and then I'm going to shade under it. Notice that I have not put in any eyelashes at this point, and I know that that's going to be really tempting because, yes, it does make it feel more lifelike to put the eyelashes in there, and we will, but we're going to wait. There's a little bit of a highlight right here, and that's close to the value here. So we're always making comparisons. We're kind of asking ourselves, is this lighter or darker than some other part around it, right? And then we're going to make the same comparison on our drawing. Okay, and then the eyeball part, whether you have, this is about halfway, you would have this gridded in so your proportions would be more accurate here. Pay attention to where the light and the dark parts of the pupil are. They are obviously, even with a dark colored eye, like if you have somebody with a really deep brown eye, the pupil is not going to all appear the same level of darkness. It's going to have some parts that are lighter or darker. It's also going to have that shading from the lid. And then in this case, look for what's called in photography the catch light, which is like that little shiny glint that's reflecting whatever the light source is in the space. And then many times the pupil will have kind of a darker edge. So that's something that you can look for. Again, check for accuracy. Don't just draw a darker edge because I said eyes have darker edges, but actually draw what you see, right? And then many eyes, particularly if the portrait was taken under like a strong light source, will have a lighter part of the pupil and then a darker part of the pupil. And oftentimes the lighter and darker parts of the pupil are the opposite of how the eyeball itself is shaded. So in this case, the lighter part is right here, and the darker part is kind of towards the top and around the catch light. And the entire time I'm shading this pupil, I'm still thinking of this as kind of a rounded spherical shape. So I'm still kind of thinking about tapering those values so that they mimic the shape of the kind of spherical ball shape. Now, how does this pupil compare to the white of the eye? Obviously, the pupil is much, much darker. Okay, and then as we get up into the skin, I'm looking at which part of this crease is darker and which part is lighter. So this one gets a little bit darker right here. So I'm going to mimic that. And another question you're going to be asking yourself, not just on the eyes, but on all of the facial shading is, once you have established which parts are lighter and which parts are darker, you're also going to ask yourself, how do those transitions between light and dark happen? Does it happen abruptly and sharply? Does it happen very gradually? And then you have to mimic the same transition when you start shading. So really, it's asking yourself the right questions besides just how you're actually shading. Is this starting to make sense? Okay. With her eyelashes, okay, on this side we see a few, just kind of over here, but many of them are kind of coming straight out towards the camera. So think of the eyelashes not as individual hairs, but as kind of areas of value. So in her case, that dark value kind of extends out a little bit. Kind of points out a little bit. There's a little tiny hint of curve over here. And then we see a few little hairs, but you're really just going to kind of suggest the idea that there are hairs there. There's a few in the reflection here, and then we see a few kind of on the bottom of the eyelid, and then we see a few over here. Pay attention to the direction that the eyelashes go, but mostly you're just going to be kind of suggesting a few. You're not going to draw in every single little hair. These need to come up a little bit. Does that make sense? Okay, so the big takeaways here are think of it like an eyeball, think of it like a sphere. I botched up the proportions there, but you guys get the idea. All of this, even the whites of the eyes, should be shaded. Okay, so remember, don't be super afraid to put values in because you are going to keep building up those areas of light and dark as you are kind of, like I said, asking yourself, what do you see? Which areas are lighter? Which areas are darker? By how much? And how do those transitions happen between the different values? Any questions? You guys feel like you can do this? Okay, good.